welcome to the Blue Your Soul podcast. We're here with Jorge Besada, a economist, a fucking thinker, writer. He's a good dude, and we've been friends for a minute on the internet and in person. Thank you for coming on the show. Appreciate it, man.
Hey, thanks, Michael. I really appreciate you taking the time to, take an interest in what I'm trying to talk about, Thanks.
I found you when you were running for, what was it, chair of the Libertarian Party? And I just heard some of the shit you were talking about, and I was like, what the fuck is this dude even talking about? Like, what is he quoting? I don't even know. But I was like, I need to talk to this dude. And I went up to you for like 2 seconds. And I looked in, and you told me your website. It was Less Marx, More Mises at the time? That's
one of the websites I have, Less Marx, More Mises. I also have Besada.com. That's where people can find my free books and so on. But yeah, Less Marx, More Mises. I'm wearing a Less Marx, More Mises shirt too.
Yeah, so I found that, and I started to read your stuff, and then we connected. But yeah, so how did you kind of get into those kind of economics and shit? Like, how did you get into that?
All right, so I'm a free marketeer. I'm someone who stumbled upon the Austrian school of economics. Those are the guys that are really behind everything that is going on. Like Karl Menger is the founder of the school. I'll talk a little bit about him. Ludwig von Mises, a lot of people have heard. Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize in 1974. And these are really the thinkers that are behind all the freedom movements that we're having. When Ron Paul was a medical student at Duke University, he read Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And he said that is what got him into looking at free markets and so on. Javier Milei, a lot of people have heard about him now, what he's doing in Argentina. He too was a guy, he stumbled up on some of Murray Rothbard's writings. And then he admitted that everything he had been teaching the previous 25 years, because he was already an economist, was wrong. And that really got him in the path to be like the great, free marketeer that he is now. And someone too like Ayn Rand, a lot of people have heard of Ayn Rand. She wrote, a lot of famous novels. She too was kind of clueless. One day she stumbles upon Ludwig von Mises. She learns economics through him. And she even said herself that everything I owe to political economy comes from Ludwig von Mises, one of these great Austrians. So again, when you scratch someone who's doing a really good job today in freedom and so on, you're going to find someone who ultimately stumble upon the Austrians. And the last one I'll throw in there is Margaret Thatcher, the famous British prime minister. She too, when she was an 18-year-old, she read Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, and that made her, a free marketeer. And so really the essence of what I'm about, Mises said, and I quote him very briefly, he said, all reasonable men are called upon to familiarize themselves with the teachings of economics. This is, in our age, the primary civic duty. So again, I'm persuaded by Mises. The people are economically ignorant. If everybody had a better understanding of economics, we wouldn't have all these problems. So that's the short version. I've written about a dozen articles for the Ludwig von Mises Institute here in the United States. A lot of the articles get republished at LewRockwell.com, another great free market website, and a couple of other places. So that is the short version, but I'll go a little in depth, tell you my story, because how I ran into the Austrians, and I can talk a little bit more about them, and I'll mention some great books, along the way. So I'm going there.
You were a part of the Ron Paul revolution, kind of. That's how you kind of got into it, because he kind of brought a lot of this ideology to the forefront, and I'd say he definitely caused a split in the Republican Party, and not even just the Republican Party, a lot of independents and libertarians and conspiracy and weird shit that people find on the internet was kind of started at that time when people noticed, hey, maybe pouring a bunch of money into the Middle East isn't a good idea. Maybe the war on drugs isn't a good idea. And that's kind of where that kind of spawned from, is 2008, definitely. That's when things changed and what kind of led to the modern movements. I'm sure he had this day.
I'm sure he probably even had something to do with what happened in Argentina, because it's a very similar revolution. And I remember Ron Paul, most people who are under 40, they stumble upon libertarianism thanks to Ron Paul. I remember a few years ago, I was in London, and just by pure luck, the weekend I was there was a big libertarian event. And they told me, oh, this is where all the libertarians in the country are going to fit in. I'm like, man, all the libertarians in the country. So we went to this pub. We had 50 people. And half of them, when you talk to people, how did you become a libertarian? Half of them, it was because of the publicity that the Ron Paul revolutions got, in the United States. So, so let me get a little, so I, myself, my story, as I get into this Austrian, is a little unique, because, so first of all, I was born in Cuba, deep into communist ideology, real hardcore atheism, communism. I mean, my grandmother used to pick me up from school, and she was like the communist Soviet woman. She had a PhD in like biology, and very atheistic type of thing. You know, she raised me to, like the Soviets, you were supposed to be good at playing chess, you know, and mathematics, and every good little Cuban knows who Yuri Gagarin, that was the first man in space, you know, famous cosmonaut in the Soviet Union. So I grew up, you know, in that type of like environment. So when I'm fast forward, you know, I lived in Spain for a while, come to the United States. While I'm getting my degree in computer science from the local university in Miami, I stumbled upon another important thinker. His name is Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer was a friend of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin once referred to Herbert Spencer as 20 times my superior. So he was one of these people who believed that the world could be explained in a sort of evolutionary way. Usually when people think of evolution, they think of just biology and the world of animals. But Herbert Spencer saw how culture and all these things, you know, can be explained in an evolutionary manner. So Herbert Spencer, key intellectual. But then now we get closer to the Austrians. One day in one of my first jobs out of college, I met a friend who just like kind of like changed my life. His name is Ted. And he tells me, hey, George, you know, you really got to read these two books. And he said, one book was called The Selfish Gene by a famous biologist, Richard Dawkins. So that book, The Selfish Gene, it tries to explain using genetics why human beings can be so selfish, because we know how nasty we can be, right? But at the same time, so altruistic, how we can go to war knowing that we're going to die, how we can donate our organs and so on. So it's a book that if you go right now to Amazon, it's going to be 50 years since it got published. It's always like number 2 or number 3 in a bunch of like categories. So that book was, you know, amazing. But then he also recommended another book. He said it was a book called Artificial Life, a report from the frontiers where computers meet biology. So it's a book about artificial life. And, you know, today AI is becoming like a big deal. So they can simulate evolution in a computer, and they can sort of like evolve self-replicating molecules and evolve like almost living little things. And another book I wanted to throw in there, there's a book called by Michael Waldrop. It's called Complexity, the Emerging Science at the Edge of Order and Chaos. And if you think about it for a second, like if an environment is too hot, like could we ever get living things inside the sun? You know, the sun, there's so much energy. It's so hot. The molecules would come around and just bounce into each other with a lot of force. We can't get life in a place that is too cold. If it's too cold, you just have ice. You just have, everything's frozen. There is no movement. But in an environment like water, where you can get little molecules to come around, to shape this way, to separate, and to make all kinds of combinations, then you can start to evolve self-replicating molecules and little things that little by little over billions of years could eventually become living things. So anyway, to make a long story short, you know, those books really got me, you know, into evolutionary psychology. People like Matt Ridley, very famous writer, Steven Pinker, you might have heard of these names, Robert Wright, and so on. So anyway, that got me. I had never read any books about anything. I was just your average guy, just wanted to play sports or whatever. But then same friend, I mean, it's just a miracle. Same friend, a few months later, he tells me, hey, George, you should read this book called The Road to Serfdom by a famous economist, you know, Friedrich Hayek. He won the prize in 1974, blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, okay. So I read the book. Now, this is not a book I would recommend to someone as a beginner, you know, or whatever. I read the book. I probably only understood like 10% of it. And I was like, well, whatever. You get that little feeling like, wow, now I read a book by a great thinker, you know, made me feel like a grown-up and that sort of thing. But it was the first book I read about economics, right? So at the same time, now we're getting to like an election time. It might have been like 2004 or something. There's like an election going on. And it's the first time, I'm sure it happens to you, to all of us. At some point, we're old enough to vote. And then it was like, well, I don't know the difference between a Democrat or a Republican. And it seems like a lot of this just comes down to like economics. So let me go to Amazon and let me find a little book about economics just to make me an informed citizen. So at the time, in 2004 already, Amazon is already kind of like growing. So I go to Amazon and I find a book that had the perfect title by a Black conservative economist. His name is Thomas Sowell. And the book was called Basic Economics, A Citizen's Guide to the Economy. Had the perfect title. You know, so anyway, so I read that, and that got me more into like really learning about economics. And I learned about the famous German hyperinflation that they had in the 1920s. You know, in Germany, in 1921, I'm sure you heard about it. Have you heard about it? The Germany?
Terrible. It was terrible. There was a sort of like anarchy there with a lot of different factions going. There was communists like doing their own little small skirmishes and anarchist groups and socialists and stuff. And it was a dark period in their time.
Yeah, it was part of this period where the Soviet Union was being formed. It was very chaotic. So the bank was printing all this money. So, I mean, without getting too much into the history of that, what I do remember reading about that, I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, if the German bureaucrats can fuck up the economy so badly, why should I not realize that maybe the American bureaucrats can also be doing the wrong thing? Especially when you're reading this book and it's criticizing minimum wage laws, and we have minimum wage laws. So anyways, it's an important moment for every libertarian to suddenly say, wait a minute, I'm not going to trust the experts. So that got me to think a little more about economics. I stumbled upon the Mises.org. I mean, everybody has to learn about this website, the Mises Institute, Mises.org, and so on. And then at some point, I stumbled, because by this time I'm already reading LewRockwell.com. Great website. Everybody has to, go to LewRockwell.com. So one day, and I'll never forget the date. It was August 21st, 2004. There was a great economist. His name is Gary North, who already died, but he's a very great economist. And he wrote an article called Imitate Hayek, where he's writing, he's encouraging people to be like Hayek, because Hayek, once he won the Nobel Prize, into old age, into his 70s, he was a very productive man. So he's telling people, imitate Hayek. So I'm reading the article. I didn't know much about Hayek. I only read the book, but I never went to the Wikipedia. I had no idea who he really was. And in the article, Gary North says that Hayek, he was still sharp at 86. I did not read The Fatal Conceit, which is Hayek's final book, until a couple of years ago. It is an intelligent book. In some ways, it is his most profound book in terms of laying out his first principles, which I do not accept Darwinian evolution. So Gary North was a very religious man, and for understandable reasons, he doubted evolution. He didn't like evolution, but he's praising Hayek. He's saying, even though Hayek wrote a great book about something I don't agree with, I think this, this is really great. So when I read that, I was very much in an evolutionary mindset. I said, what is this whole thing about evolution and Hayek? It never occurred to me. So then by that time, Amazon had the search inside feature where you can look inside books, Mm-hmm. So anyway, long story short, I go to Amazon.com. I start looking inside the books. Like Hayek wrote a sequence of books called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where Hayek explains his ideas and all this stuff. And it was a book very much about looking at society as an evolutionary outgrowth, looking at the evolution of money, the evolution of culture, the evolution of language, the evolution of everything. And I'll just throw one last quote in there that culminates. So at the end of the book, in the epilogue, Hayek summarizes, and he says the following, quote, "We understand now that all enduring structures above the level of the simplest atoms, up to the brain and society, are the results of and can be explained only in terms of processes of selective evolution." So to Hayek, and a lot of these Austrians, he felt like, look, evolution is a process that explains everything: the biological order, the complexity of the brain, society, culture, everything. So that is that is kind of like my intellectual upbringing to all these things. Then at some point, I was involved. I said, well, where can I find the fellow free marketeers? Now that I understand capitalism, where can I find them? Oh, they're the Libertarian Party, Libertarian Party. So I was going to run for Congress in the 2004 election. And as the process of getting signatures, because to run for office, you either got to pay 10 grand to get on the ballot, or you got to get the signatures. So while I'm getting the signature, I'm telling people, no, we got to get rid of minimum wage laws. Government spending is bad. And everybody's just like, how it is. You try to tell people, and people just react. Yeah. And by that time, I had also read a great book I have to recommend. It's called Darwinian Politics. It's a book that, like Hayek says, wait a minute, human beings, we evolved in little tribes. We're tribal creatures. We evolved to beat each other up, to take from the haves, for violence, for rape. That's what we evolved for. This whole thing about the market economy and trade and commerce and money and interest rates and economic competition, that is not part of our instincts. Our instincts are for slaughter, So it's a very good book. And then I realized, wait a minute, I want to write a book that marries my newfound love for Austrian economics and biology, what Dawkins and all these people. So that's what got me eventually, to get into the intellectual thing and write a book, A Hayekian Worldview, which I eventually published in 2011. But so anyway, that's kind of just then I got into the whole Ron Paul thing. I finished my book, and I've just been involved in some kind of liberty-oriented thing.
I love the book. I mean, I've read some of it. I haven't read all of it. It's a hefty book. And I have some stuff from it I'll bring up and ask you about. One thing I found interesting about what you were talking about was Hayek's rejection of Darwinianism. Why is that? Why did he reject that, and exactly what?
Well, what I just mentioned now, it wasn't Hayek that rejected the Darwinianism. It was Gary North, the guy who wrote the article praising Hayek.
So why did he reject it? I mean,
why did he reject it?
Yes.
Oh, I really do not know, like, why Gary North. He's very involved. He's someone who died maybe like 5 years ago, and he was a great economist. He interviewed Hayek. He knew him personally. Now I do not know why he rejects Darwinian evolution, but I know he had some religious views that he felt. I mean, there's a lot of people who feel like genetics is pseudoscience. I mean, wherever things are very complicated, it's very easy to make mistakes. And there's a lot of people who feel like there just isn't enough strong evidence for Darwinian evolution to work the way it does. And some people, because of their religious views as well, you know, they might not. So I really do not know. I remember that Gary North was a very, like, he had very strong religious views about some type of Christianity.
On that genetic stuff, I was thinking about something I read of yours, and you were talking about the kind of nonsense that is the racial IQ comparisons, and that there's a thing there where you were talking about how bone structures in Africans are more advanced than other races, and I was thinking, like, that kind of makes sense. Like, different races evolve in different locations breed different advantages and disadvantages, and that's one thing that you don't hear a lot. I found that interesting.
True. I'm glad. I'm flattered you got that far, and you got curious and you looked in there. But part of the misconceptions that we have, there's so much fear looking at potential biological differences between human beings. I mean, people are scared to suddenly say, oh, wait a minute, what if there are some significant IQ differences that make some people smarter than others, or some people some different than others? I mean, that is, a lot of people are scared, to say that, if it is the case. Yeah. But one of the things that I try to mention in the book is, like, first of all, even if that were the case, even if some people, I mean, I'll just use the example that all, like, the racists want to use. Some people want to say that black people are dumb or whatever. They'll say, oh, black people have lower IQ or whatever. But first of all, even if that were the case, okay, which I personally don't think so. IQs, I want to recommend the book by Thomas Sowell. It's called Race in America. I think it's one of the books that I really use for that section, where Thomas Sowell does an incredible job of showing how you have different groups of migration into the United States. He talks about the Puerto Ricans, he talks about the Germans, he talks about the Irish, and he talks about, obviously, he has a massive chapter on black people. And he talks about how black people, how you can even see within one generation, a lot of this IQ stuff is very, like, variable. If you take a small child, and since he's growing up, you talk to him, you get that little brain thinking, he's going to grow up. Why? It's the software. Right? You can take an old computer and connect it to the internet, to modern software, and you can do way more powerful things than even if you have a supercomputer that is not connected to the internet. So what really creates civilization is the culture, and our brains are very malleable. So, I mean, I forgot, like, all the details, but I personally just don't buy into the whole IQ stuff. But one of the points that comes from, like, economics is, like, we want freedom. If some people are super smart and they're going to be like the fancy engineers, right? We want the freedom for those people to rise as high as they're able to. And if those of us are not super smart, then we'll just take on another job. We'll be the ones that change the tires. We'll be the one that does something that doesn't require, that much intelligence. And it works for the two of us. We just want a free society wherever it falls, where they land. And obviously in that section, I do talk a lot about, like, physical differences. And this ties into, like, race and hip hop and so on. For example, black people got bigger dicks, and they make better athletes in some ways. And that was a big deal. I mean, I don't know how long we want to get into, like, the history of slavery and race relations in America. But as I'm sure interracial relations, between black men and white women have been a massive thorn, in the United States, for race relation stuff. And it's just, but anyway, I don't know how we got
You talked about how the slave owners encouraged promiscuity because of their wanting for breeding more people, more slaves, and how that had generational impacts potentially. Isn't that what you mentioned?
Gosh, it's been so long. I reread that.
You did write it 15 fucking years ago. So.
Yeah. So, yeah. A lot of the slaves, the slaves might have had, like, their tough, big, strong, and they might have this guy, have sex, to just like breeding cattle. I wonder if some of that went on at the time. And yeah, I mean, it's awful, all the weird things that went in there. But Yeah, but again, but regarding what happens, to like the Black community, we can talk about it later. What really decimated.
We'll get into that.
Yeah,
later
we'll get into
down
that
the
later.
line.
But
I mean, and back on Hayek's book, I mean, there's so many things that I found very interesting. And this quote that I was texting you about, because I went back to look at it before this interview. All right, so one quote from Hayek's Road to Serfdom is, "The National Socialist right and the left in Germany is the kind of conflict that will always arise between rival socialist factions." So, and the left is the left socialism is kind of based in like egalitarianism, and the right is based in like nationalism, sometimes ethnic nationalism. Like, how would you compare those two different sides of socialism, and how are you seeing that kind of evolve in modern politics?
I mean, I understand what Hayek is saying. I mean, you have one socialism, again, it's like the Soviet kind, where they just, everybody is equal. The Soviets were very much about international socialism. They wanted to treat the blacks equal, everybody equal rights, and so on, which is good in a way, but obviously they still have the course of central planning. Now the Nazis, like the socialism of the right is more to protect our culture, and our identity, to protect our jobs. We want to have tariffs, the socialism of that way, was more of protecting what they considered to be what created their greatness, which is like their race or their history and that type of stuff. But it's still socialism, obviously, because you still have some central planners, running around the economy and preventing society, from evolving in other ways that freedom might allow. And obviously we do see a little bit of that here. I mean, I don't want to call like Trump's policies like too much socialist, but we know that they are, to protect the workers here. He falls for all the bullshit of the super high tariffs. We're going to have our economy here. We have to protect, our identity, and not allowing more freedom to be what evolves, the identity and so on. So, I mean, again, it would be a big mistake to call the United States like, national socialist, but obviously we can see a little bit of the same fallacies. Everybody wants to protect their identity and their jobs, by passing all kinds of like idiotic laws and central planning. And again, that's the socialism of, both sides. So, I mean, I can understand what Hayek is saying.
That's kind of there's always the appeal to like jobs. There's always the thing like, which candidate will create more jobs? And it's like, why does the government need a role in that? I don't know. It's like one thing people should
You're
kind
right.
of ask. I mean, there's some case. I mean, that's kind of one thing I wrote down about monopolies. That's one thing that people kind of, when they look at the certain ideologies of like anarcho-capitalism, they think that monopolies, will cause that. And Hayek kind of even talks about that. He says, anyone who has observed how aspiring monopolists regularly seek and frequently obtain the assistance of the power of the state to make their control effective can doubt it, but there's nothing inevitable about this development. Something like that. How do you personally think that the government can end up creating monopolies, that it's not just some sort of like rather organic thing that comes out of nowhere?
I think what Hayek is referring to there is like, we have to be cognizant of how sometimes big businesses trying to do what they think is going to make them money, right? They're inevitably going to ask for government privilege, to stamp out competition, which is what will help them create the monopolies, right? In a real like competitive free market society, in reality, only governments for the most part, can really help create the monopolies by preventing competition. Right. So, I mean, I think what Hayek means is that we have to be cognizant of that, big corporations, they're going to be incentivized. They're always going to have some salesman or some great CEO who's going to have a great idea. Oh, well, we can pass these laws or these regulations, So I think that's what he's doing. He's just warning us that, we got to be careful. We cannot let the government stamp out competition. That's what a lot of these regulations do, right? Like the medical sector is totally paralyzed by regulation. I think in the United States, there's only really like 3 or 4 like insurance companies, Aetna, Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And that's all because it's virtually impossible to compete. If you're the doctor and you want to open up a hospital, you need like $1 million in like legal fees and all that stuff. So the regulations are what create these monopolies.
You see that in a lot of like kind of social media companies. Like whenever some violence happens, everything is wiped off the internet or something from somebody that would use a social media platform or something. There's that. When elections happen, especially the social media companies bend the knee to whoever wants them to say whatever on the platform. It's the whole thing. I mean, and then Theo, like, there's this kind of mischaracterization of people that run companies as freedom oriented people. Certain companies like Theo or Teal, whatever the fuck you
Peter
pronounce
Thiel.
his name. People call him like he's like the devil. Like he is like a tool of the government. There's so many people that are just tools. Like people think corporations really have that power, but like their lifeblood there is the government at the end of the day, and the elites that want them to do what they want to do. I mean, what do you think of that?
Wow, it's an extremely complicated mess because you have people, you have their ideologies. Like Peter Thiel, from my understanding, Peter Thiel is like a Zionist. I think he's a Zionist. He
is, yeah.
Right, and George Carlin, he was like a famous comedian. George Carlin.
Yeah, he's the best. Yeah, my dad raised me on his shit. Like my dad would always show me his stand up when I was like real young. Yeah.
Good. So George Carlin has a wonderful quote where he says that when interests converge, you do not need a formal conspiracy. Right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. So when people think alike, just because they have the same ideology and they think alike, they're going to meet each other and they're going to act in a way that makes it look like it's a conspiracy. But in reality, it's not a conspiracy. Am I making sense? Like,
yeah.
Right.
The conspiracy is kind of like an oversimplification of things. Well, there probably is that there, but the interests converge. Yes,
exactly. Sure. Yeah. So this is very tricky and it's very important because this deals a lot with Jew-Gentile problems and Zionism. How much of like Jewish influence in society is the result of a nefarious conspiracy by the Jews, or is it just people who have a shared ideology, who have shared concerns, and because of that shared ideology and those shared concerns, they're going to end up acting. They're going to recognize each other and they're going to be acting in unison. So it's very important to realize this. But anyway, you mentioned Peter Thiel and the censorship on the internet. I'm sure you might have heard that just a few days ago, there was this one Israeli guy in the United States who had a high job in Israeli security, and he was busted soliciting sex with like a 15-year-old girl, right? And then the guy was able to go back to Israel. And then supposedly some guy tweeted some information about this, and the Israeli government managed to persuade X to remove the tweets. So,
oh my God, don't even get me. Yeah, like there's a whole thing. Whitney Webb talks about how multiple Israelis have fled to Israel.
Exactly. So
pedophiles, so pedophilia, and they get away with it. Really, that's a sickening thing. And it's just exhibit A of the government and social media kind of being one and the same. And that's why I encourage people that really want to know what's going on to download alternative platforms like Rumble or Odyssey, Gab, BitChute.
Yeah, so that's a great example of how the government inevitably uses violence to enforce the leading ideology of the day. And I mean, we're kind of jumping ahead, but a lot of this, we can see how Zionism, there's far more censorship. There is the new UNRWA definition of Zionism, of anti-Semitism, where if you say that a Jew, has the double, who feels loyal to Israel more than to America, that's already considered anti-Semitism. And obviously the ADL is trying to constantly put pressure X to censor and so on. And Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the CEO of the ADL, he said that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So already criticized. Right. And he also said that anti-Zionism is genocide. So the mentality To brand someone who is critical of Zionism, an evil terrorist or a genocidal person, to then put him in jail. I mean, that's coming. And when one looks at the history of the Soviet Union, which hopefully we'll get to in a second, when one looks at the history of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, a lot of the original Bolsheviks, all of those were ideologues who were very much for pro-freedom of speech. The early Bolsheviks, they remember being oppressed by the Tsarist government and being sent to Siberia, for their views. So they were ideologically very much for freedom. But once they got into power, they realized that the only way they can sustain their ideology is by coercing people. And suddenly, obviously in the Soviet Union, eventually freedom of speech went out the window, even though they had it in the constitution, and you became a heretic. And if you question, communism and so on, the NKVD and the secret police, would kill you. And we're seeing the same thing. It's becoming a hate crime, to question Zionism and so on. And so we see the same. If one really understands the history of the Soviet Union, one can see that Zionism, which is really like our religion of our day, is really becoming more and more like coercive. But anyway, we're kind of getting ahead, I feel.
Yeah, let's just kind of go. I was gonna ask, you've been comparing the Bolshevik Revolution to the Zionist Revolution. Do you think it's at its height, or do you think it's gonna get even worse? Like, what do you think?
Okay, before we get to that, let me say a couple of things. Let's get back to the pure economics. I want to say a couple of things. Yeah, let me say a couple of things about Carl Menger, because, we're having this little discussion, and I want to bring up things that I think, are important and everyone should hear about. And so Carl Menger, he's the so-called founder of the Austrian School of Economics, okay? And he's a guy that you don't hear about that much, but he's like a very important person, and I want to, mention something about him. So Carl Menger, he's the guy who came up with, you remember like Back to the Future? I'm assuming you've seen the Back to the Future movies, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you know what the flux capacitor is? Do you remember that?
I know it's like a tool or something.
Right. So the flux capacitor is like the device that Doc Brown invented that made time travel possible. It's like the special device, and that's what makes it, time travel possible. So Carl Menger came up with what I consider to be the flux capacitor idea of the social sciences, okay? The most important idea that explains much of how the world works. And that is Carl Menger's insights into the evolution of money, okay? Of money. Like money, so let me say something very important about money and how all this stuff works. Like, if you look at a tribal society from high above, right? Imagine a little tribe of like 100 people, right? And you're looking at them from high above. If you look at the contents of their brains, they all have the same information. Every person in a tribal society has the same information. They all have to speak the same language, simple language. They all know how to make the same simple tools, how to make the same simple foods, whatever. Their knowledge is repeated across every brain, right? Now, in a massive modern society, you have what's called the division of labor and the division of information, right? Where every brain has only the information that it needs, right? When you have the division of labor and division of information, like I can learn how to make a coconut pastry. I'm the only person that knows how to make the coconut pastry. That information is just in my brain. But then when I trade my coconut pastry for a basket, right? I don't have to know anything about the basket, right? But just by trading my coconut pastries for the basket, I am a benefactor of all the information that went into making the basket. I can trade my coconut pastries for the guy who makes chairs, and I have to know nothing about the chair. All the information of how to make the chairs and the baskets is only in those brains that need it, okay? So by just learning how to do one thing, you can now trade for 1,000,000 things. So now you can have a society where you can have an unlimited amount of information spread efficiently through all the brains. So that's what the division of labor and the division of information gives you, okay? You cannot have a modern civilization if you're limited to the information that fits in the brain of 100 people, right? So Carl Menger's in most important insight is that in order for you to have the division of labor and division of information, to have trade is what allows this, you need money, right? Without money, how is a heart surgeon going to trade his services for toothpicks, right? You're gonna wait for the guy that has a toothpick, to have a heart attack, A heart surgeon needs all this expensive equipment. You need money for all of these things. So money is what enables the division of labor, the division of information, and everything that creates like modern civilization. We need money for profit and loss calculation, very important. In the private sector, This is very important. In the private sector, everything is in a never-ending cycle of the production of wealth, right? We're constantly increasing the economic pie, and the consumption of wealth, right? Every business has sales revenue. That is a sign of how much wealth you have added to the economic pie. But they also have costs, right? That is a measure of how much wealth you have consumed from the economic pie. If you have more sales revenue than costs, then you have a profit, which means that you are increasing the economic pie, right? So how do you do this economic calculation? You need money. You need the numbers. You need money so you can properly do all this, economic calculation to ensure that you're guiding your actions in a manner where you're producing more than you're consuming. If you're inadvertently consuming more than you're producing, you're going to destroy civilization, right? So you need money for that. The second thing I'll throw in there very quickly is how economic competition turns the entire planet into a global supercomputer, right? Every company in the private sector, like I have no idea who came up with power door locks and power windows. I just assume it was a Honda engineer working in Tokyo, right? So he comes up with a better idea, right, Honda, but then economic competition motivates BMW in Germany, Ford in the US, right, to copy the power door locks and power windows idea, right? So if you look at it from high above, like using Google Maps, you can see how the private sector, you always have businessmen coming up with innovations, but competition forces them to copy the innovations of competitors, right? So this is the mechanism that constantly turns civilization into a supercomputer, where private sector companies are constantly innovating and copying innovations and thus continuously improving society. And this gets into why communism doesn't work. Communism, there's no competition. There's just one big government bureaucracy that doesn't have to learn, doesn't have to copy from anyone else, So anyway, so the point I want to make is that economic competition, which I just tried to summarize, profit and loss calculation, all of these things need money. So Carl Menger, I'm not going to get into it because I talked about it enough. So Carl Menger showed, this is very important, one of the key insights of Carl Menger showed that money, something that is so important for the workings of civilization, was not the result of any planning or design, or our genius, right? It just evolved on its own. I'm not going to get into it. And that is one of the reasons why we live in this incredibly complex world where we have money, economic competition, and all these fancy things, yet nobody understands the economy. Like imagine, here's an analogy that I like to use, and hopefully this will really make sense. Like if you look at cells, the cells in your body, right? The cells, your body is coordinated by the respiratory system, the digestive system, the nervous systems. All of these systems that are part of your body, they ultimately evolved thanks to the actions of cells. Over millions of years, we went from single cell life form to multicellular life form. So all of these mechanisms, they all evolved. They're the result of the actions of cells, but we know that the cells didn't design them, right? The cells 2 million years ago didn't get together and say, oh, we need a respiratory system so we can all get together and make humans. They didn't, right? It's the same thing with the economy. That is the great insight of Carl Menger. The economy is an evolved growth. When we were little tribes where everybody had the same information, somehow, little by little, we stumbled upon money. And then we started getting competition, innovation, and so on. And little by little, we created massive civilization. But the key insight of Menger is that money and just like language is another perfect example. No caveman sat down and said, oh, I'm going to invent language so we can all communicate a lot better. Language is something that is the result of human action, but not the result of our planning. So the same thing happened with money, the same thing happened with the economy, and so on. So that is like a key insight of Carl Menger that a lot of people, are not aware of. And he really is like the founder of the Austrian school. And so anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. And so I wrote a little article for the Mises Institute that is called Carl Menger's Overlooked Vital Evolutionary Insights that I think I do a far better job of, summarizing there. But I hope what I said kind of like makes sense, that it helps to look at society like as an evolutionary growth, just like we look at the biological order. And
certain ideologies just kind of go against human nature and the way things kind of work, the way humans naturally want more, they want better. And if you need a group of people to decide on what is better, like that's not going to work, because the group of people are somebody in the group's going to think this, the collectives people call it. And that's why collectivism ultimately fails historically, you know. So that's a profound thing. And one question I kind of want to ask you, because we're talking about like the way things have evolved over time, is like when you talk to certain people. All right, so if you talk to communists, they'll view they hate the old world. They want to kind of erase what previously happened, right? Prior to that kind of ideology existing. And they kind of phrase the old world as destructive kind of capitalism, state capitalism, anarcho-capitalism, in terms of, you could argue some of that happened with imperialism, but there's an argument that it could be state capitalism. That was kind of some weird shit going on there when they were like, you know, Belgium. Anyways, then you ask a National Socialist, what do they think of the old world? And they just love it. They love the buildings. They love the way that society kind of was back then, despite the brutality. Then you ask a sort of like capitalist intellectual. That's what I'm going to ask you is, what do you think of the old world? How did it run? What would you call it? How did economics run in like a monarchy? And how did that kind of change in the 1800s?
Yeah. So, you know, the old world, like, you know, one of the things that one of the major events, or one of the major events was for something, for example, like the Protestant Reformation. You know, Martin, before like the Catholic Church, you know, had like a lot of power, right? Martin Luther comes along and he says, wait a minute, we should have the freedom to interpret the Bible how we want. We shouldn't just be coerced by this, you know, massive priesthood. And inadvertently, by breaking up the coercive power of the church, people, before, they were serfs, right? They just did the same thing their father did, and their father did, and they all worked their own little plot of land for the local lord and the church and that kind of stuff. But when Martin Luther helped break up the coercive power of the church, that gave more freedom inadvertently to people. And now people have the freedom not just to work for the landlord or the church, but maybe to start working for each other. And that inadvertently helped create the culture of private businesses, where you have the freedom to produce for the masses instead of just doing the same thing over and over and over and over for the church. So that's one of those potential changes. You know, it wasn't so simple. But one of the things that happened like in the 1600s, right? Once we got something like the steam engine, right? Once you got the steam engine, now you have machines that can produce wealth at a much faster rate. So you started getting factories. And since the factories are producing wealth at a much faster rate, then the factories have to compete against each other. If we have one factory that is producing a lot of wealth, it needs to hire laborers away from the other factory, right? So you started having competition where entrepreneurs are starting to make the factories better, and they're producing more. And since they're producing more, they have to compete, right? Competition is what increases our pay, because the more productive the companies get, the more wealth they have to offer laborers in exchange. So it's very important for the clueless masses to understand that it's increases in production that through competition by employers is what raises our living standard. So what was happening in the 1700s and 1800s, as the factories started getting more productive, that's where all the good jobs were. So people were leaving the farms to go live in the cities where they could get the higher paying jobs. So that's one of the things that happened. But then what happened is like the cities were getting so complicated, and you started getting differences in wealth. You know, some rich businessman could now afford a lot more than a poor peasant. And that gave birth to socialist ideology and mythology. The masses, they fool themselves by the growing complexity of the social order, and they say, wait a minute, freedom is unfair. Why not just why have 20 CEOs with many profits? You know, why not just have the government run everything? Why not standardize? Why have 20 different cars where we can just have one car, right? So all of these fallacies started to make sense to the totally clueless masses. You know, something like finance and banking is very important too. Like businessmen, you know, they were making a lot of money, but what they were doing with this money, they would save it, they would give it to the banks, and then the banks would loan it out to another businessman who would use the money to hire workers, right? Economically ignorant people have no idea that a lot of their paychecks comes from the savings of the rich, right? Bill Gates has billions of dollars. Is he eating billions of pizzas? Is he driving billions of cars? So I have less? No, he takes his money, right? So most people don't know that the wealth of the rich is the very same wealth that your employer borrowed to pay your paycheck while you're working on something. Right, but what happened is that, again, the cities were getting very complex. Economic ignorance was running rampant. Eventually, Karl Marx writes a very little book called The Communist Manifesto that packages all of these fallacies in a way that made sense to a bunch of young men wanting to be, great leaders, right? So that's what happened. Eventually, you got the Bolshevik Revolution, right? Which I'll say a few more things because then we can compare it to Zionism, right?
I have one question about that after you're done, but yeah, like about the rise of Marx. I mean, I was gonna say, like, Hayek talks about comparing it. I mean, you're talking about the same time frame, which is the French Revolution. So how did it? What do you know about how it? Because he kind of says it was birthed out of the French Revolution. What do you think of that?
Yes. Oh yeah. And I distinctly remember because Hayek. I read some of Hayek's writings about this. So during the French Revolution, the French Revolution was in many ways like a communist Bolshevik revolution, but like 100 years earlier. So what happened during the French Revolution? During the French Revolution, we already started to get some like scientific improvements, and the idea, because remember, it would have been very, very hard for you to be an atheist, like in the year 100 or in the year 1000. It was very hard.
You'd be called a witch and shot in the face.
Yeah. But by the time we get to the French Revolution, there's a lot of scientific progress that is being made. A lot of people are starting to doubt, the church. And what happened?
The founding fathers were deists, right? Like they weren't even, a lot of the founding fathers weren't even religious. Like some of them weren't, but
right. So in the French Revolution, that was the first time where a bunch of like atheists, sort of like were the state, because before the church had always been the state, right? But in the French Revolution, they chopped off the king's head, and suddenly they made the state subvert, the big like ruler, and they suddenly got the idea that you can plan society. They said, well, the church is illegitimate. We're going to have the experts run society. And the leading French socialist, his name was Saint-Simon, and Hayek talks about him. So Saint-Simon believed that we should have a council of Newton. Newton, the great genius who, he invented calculus, the laws of planetary motion, and so on. So since Newton and the science was making so much progress, that made it easy for irreligious people to discard, the church and plan society. Remember, like when God and the church runs everything, people can't say, oh, I'm going to remake society. You can't, because that goes against God's laws. How could you possibly be a dictator when you're supposed to respect the 10 Commandments? You can't do that, right?
Makes no sense, yeah.
Yeah, it makes no sense. And Hayek talks about this. In the past, the idea of people inventing law would have seemed ridiculous. You don't invent law. Law is God's law. You discover God's laws. You interpret the Bible to see what God is telling you. You don't invent law. You can't be a dictator and decide how things work. Things work on a moral ground. So Hayek talks about that. So the French Revolution was this first time where a bunch of atheists said, forget it, forget the church. We're going to have a council of Newton. And this is what he really called it, Saint-Simon, French socialist.
That's interesting.
He called it the council. He said, we're going to run society with the council of Newton. We're going to have 3 mathematicians, 3 architects, 3 physicists, and based on their genius, since they're smarter, they're going to tell everybody else what to do. So this was the first time we had this crazy idea that we're going to have central planning by the experts, and we're going to discard, law. So that's why Hayek, and he mentions that in the Counter-Revolution of Science, in his book. So that is where Hayek is saying that really the Bolshevik Revolution was just almost a repeat of the French Revolution. So the takeaway from the French Revolution, it was the first time where finally reason and the science said, oh, the hell with religion or traditions and everything that got us to where we are in the town. No, we, the experts, are going to order society and tell everybody else what to do, of course, for the greater good. So that is the connection.
And that kind of caused a change in their government a bunch of fucking times afterward. Like it just didn't work. And I have one question for you about that. One last question before we get into comparing Bolshevism and Zionism. Why did the American Revolution succeed and the French Revolution fail?
Wow. I think the American Revolution, it was just based on a different sort of like ideology. The American Revolution was based on like a legal concept. It was more like, people have rights. People have inalienable rights, to property, and so on. So it was different in that sense. It wasn't like the French Revolution. I mean, first of all, the French Revolution came after the American Revolution, I think.
Around the same time, but kind of based after, but
yeah, it came after. So maybe the American Revolution, and we got very lucky. The American founders were very wise people. I mean, few people know just how well read Thomas Jefferson was reading economics books from like great economists. These are people who really just had a really good understanding of history, how to make they were really concerned with preventing government power. And it's also just the pure luck of the way history evolves. The Americans wanted freedom, from the British, right? So they wanted to make sure that they would check the power of government, and so on. And our circumstances were different. We were not living in France with a massive Catholic bureaucracy, controlling everything. So we had different, circumstances that led to a slightly different character, But yeah.
We lucked out, and I'm very happy to be an American.
Yeah. Actually, the same gentleman that I told you earlier, Gary North, who wrote that article about imitating Hayek. I forgot the title of the article, but he wrote a great article making the case that the Americans, we should have never had the American Revolution and stayed within the British Empire. Because think about it, we had a revolution.
What is he talking about?
Yeah.
What the fuck is he talking about? No, I'm not trying to be rude to him, but like, what do you mean?
Yeah, but remember, we went over a revolution and we were only paying like 2% taxes. Yeah, today we pay 40% taxes to our own American government. So he was
for the healthcare of the IDF.
Oh yeah.
So continue. Yes.
Anyway, that was just a little side note. It was a great article, that he wrote, and so one final little thing that I want to like tell before we get into like the Bolshevik thing. I want to talk a little bit more about the Mises and Hayek connection, and how these men literally saved civilization, because there's a lot of important history there. So I wrote an article for the Mises Institute that was called "How Austrian Economists Repeatedly Saved Civilization." So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of these two men, how they're intertwined. So when the Bolshevik Revolution, so we already talked a little bit about the Bolshevik Revolution, right? The social order was getting complex. Socialist mythology started growing and spreading. Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto, and somehow Lenin and all these socialist ideologues, they went ahead and they took control of Russia. So during 1919 is when the Bolshevik Revolution is just expanding. You got the Red Army, killing the old order. They're fighting Poland. They're expanding west. They're trying to move to Austria and so on. But by 1919, Ludwig von Mises was one of the atlases, the greatest man of civilization. He already had a profound understanding of economics. So he's looking at everybody falling for socialist mythology, right? Socialism is an ideology that was spreading like wildfire. So Mises sees this and he's like, man, I mean, I got to do something, right? So Mises, he himself takes it upon himself, just one man, and he talks to the leading Austrian politicians and he persuades them away from joining Moscow and what would eventually become the Soviet Union. And he did this on his own, pretty much, right? So this is what Mises says. He says in his memoirs, he says, there were few who recognized the state of affairs clearly. People were so convinced of the inevitability of Bolshevism that their main concern was securing a favorable place for themselves in the new order. The Catholic Church and its followers, the Christian Social Party, were prepared to befriend the Bolshevists with the same eagerness with which the bishops and archbishops would embrace National Socialism 20 years later. So Mises is explaining even the church was falling, for the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
Mises says, I knew what was at stake. Bolshevism would lead Vienna to starvation and terror within a few days. Plundering hordes would take to the streets, and a second bloodbath would destroy what was left of Viennese culture. After discussing these problems with the Bauers, leading politicians in Austria, over the course of many days, I was finally able to persuade them of my view And Bauer's resulting moderation was a determining factor in Vienna's fate. Mises, the most important task I undertook was the forestalling of the Bolshevist takeover. The fact that events did not lead to such a regime in Vienna was my success and mine alone. Few supported me in my efforts. I alone convinced the Bauers to abandon the idea of seeking union with Moscow. I mean, that's badass. To think that one man was able to prevent this entire country from falling for Soviet tyranny. That's one instance where the Austrians saved Western civilization. Because had the Bolsheviks moved on to Vienna, who knows what else? You know, who knows what other dominoes would have fallen? So then the second little piece that gets into the road to serfdom, you know, Hayek's famous book. So soon after, Mises, at the time, he hired Hayek. Hayek was a young man working for Mises in Austria, right? And Mises, in 1922, he writes a book called Socialism, which is just like a masterpiece. So that book, like, it really educated a lot of people, including Hayek. So then Hayek goes to London, and he becomes a big shot in London, in the London School of Economics during the 1930s. So then what happens now? The Second World War breaks out, right? And towards the end of the war, Hayek is in England, and he realizes that all of the socialist myths and fallacies and the big government and all the economic fallacies, they're spreading through England. And Hayek says, wait a minute, I need to write a book to wake up the British masses and let them know that even though you have a tradition of freedom and individual rights and democracy and all this bullshit, that you too are going to be on the road to serfdom. Right? So Hayek, so during the Second World War, you know, during the last few years of the war, Hayek writes this book. And then the book comes out, I think it was in March of 1944, you know, the war's still going on. But then what happens is that when the book comes out, the book is a success in England. And Henry Hazlitt, who's a big free market guy, Henry Hazlitt is a fellow Austrian. He's the guy who wrote the most popular economics book ever written, Economics in One Lesson. So Henry Hazlitt reads Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, and he loves the book. Right? So then he was working at the New York Times at the time, and he writes a glowing review, and he puts it in the front page of the New York Times book review section. So that causes a storm of interest in Hayek's book, right? So then when Hayek comes to the United States to go on a speaking tour, instead of giving a speaking tour in a small economics department in some little-known university, Hayek's first gig is in a massive, maybe like basketball-sized stadium to like 3,000 people. Right? So Hayek suddenly becomes like a mega free market star, you know, in the United States. But then there's another important piece to this. Then one of their friends, there's a gentleman, his name is Max Eastman. And this is a very important person because he's a good example of how we can change our minds and go from wasting our lives doing stupid things like socialism and Zionism, and then do the right thing. So Max Eastman was one of America's leading socialists in the 1920s, I think, at least in the 1920s. He was such a famous socialist. He went to Moscow, and he was a friend of Trotsky, and he translated some of Trotsky's works to English. I mean, it doesn't get more commie than that. But Max Eastman, at some point, he stumbles upon Mises and Hayek, and he realized that he had devoted his life to a total calamity, and he changes his mind, and he becomes one of the greatest freedom fighters. So then Max Eastman, at the time, he's working for the Reader's Digest. You're probably a little too young to remember, but the Reader's Digest was a little publication that was very cheap, and it was sent out to many homes.
Yeah, I know what that is. Yeah.
Okay, good. So you know it. So what Max Eastman did, he took Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which it's kind of like a tough read. It's 250 pages. It's not an easy read. So he took all the wisdom in the book, and he created a condensed version, which was only 40 pages long. So he took all the wisdom of that book, and he put it into a 40-page little version that would be easily sold mass market paperback. And that version of the book was eventually read by over 1 million people. Okay.
And which book is that?
The Road to Serfdom. Yeah.
What's the 40-page thing though?
Oh, the 40-page version is called The Road to Serfdom, the condensed edition.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So he took a 250-page book, and he summarized it into just 40 pages, right? All the wisdom of The Road to Serfdom, he managed to summarize it into just 40 pages. And since it was a lot shorter, now 1 million people read it, right? So that was that was incredible because that got so many more people to get interested in Hayek, in free markets, and so on. And like I said earlier, Hayek's The Road to Serfdom is one of those books. Ron Paul became a free marketeer, Margaret Thatcher, a lot of these people. So in that article, I summarized the story I just told you. So that is two instances where Mises and Hayek literally saved civilization. Mises by preventing the Bolsheviks from continuing in Austria, and Hayek by educating so many, future, free marketeers. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to get that little, piece in there. And so now, we can talk about like how Zionism and communism are really very similar.
Yeah, I know, and I've read that article before. I think that was like one of the first articles of yours I read. Like, because we had that call once, and you were telling me to read that, and I really like that article. And but another article I like of yours is an analysis and comparison of socialist and Zionist ideological calamities, and I have a lot of questions about this one. Like there's been an infiltration of our country at its very site. Like, where will that kind of lead us with the kind of like, it's weird. It's still different because there wasn't right in the Bolshevik. It was kind of just Russians mainly, but here it's like there's another country lobbying and in the media, and governments to persuade us to police speech, police religion in a way, with the whole you can't say Christ is king or some shit. It's a whole thing. So like, why is it similar and different than the Bolshevik Revolution?
Okay, so first of all, so they're similar. The first thing we have to look at them, we have to see them as ideologies, as complex ideologies that fooled a lot of smart, well-intentioned people to a total calamity. Right? To me, they have that in common. Now, it's very important to see it as the complex evolution of an ideology and not a malicious conspiracy, right? When we look at the history of communism, it would be a huge error to say that communism was just an evil conspiracy by Marx and Lenin so they can gain power and exploit everyone else for some sinister purpose. It looks that way to naive thinkers, but those who really understand the history and the complex evolution of the whole ideology, we know that is not the case, right? And I just briefly told you, right? Communism was an ideology that spread because society was getting more complex and people thought it would be better than capitalism, right? So that's the first thing we have to realize, that, that Zionism and communism, they share that. Communism made sense to the economically ignorant, and Zionism made sense to the Jews who were trying to escape anti-Semitism in Europe. It makes sense. So in that sense, so let me read you one very important quote from Hayek that captures the essence of this stuff. So Hayek says, most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our times have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler or Mussolini or Lenin or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. This is a great quote, right? We can't just say that communism or Nazism came just because Hitler was evil and he just wanted to conquer the world. No, it came around. Exactly. It made sense to people. Oh, wait a minute. Religious people are irrational. We need the experts to tell everybody what to do. We just need to destroy the churches and kill all the priests. And that's what Lenin did, right?
100,000 priests killed, something like that.
Oh, yeah, like 80,000. Yeah.
Crazy number.
Yeah.
Priests killed. It's disgusting. Yeah, continue here.
But that's very good. We have to understand how people fool themselves into that calamity. And to the atheist communists who believe in central planning and believing in rationality. If you're a religious person, you can't really prove 100%, how you see things, right? But to the communists who are for reason, and the science and all that, that is irrational. We can't tolerate that. So they said, if we're going to have a wonderful world ruled by the science, where the experts tell everybody else what to do and everybody's going to be a great chess player, we need to get rid of religion. So it made sense to them that religious people, especially when religious people are saying, wait a minute, It's not right for you to take the grain of other people. You have to respect private property. You have to respect the 10 Commandments. When religious people are being attacked by the communists, religious people are not calling the communists economically misguided. They were calling them evil. They were calling them satanic. So that leads to problems. Remember, the Soviets think that they're doing good for society by getting rid of religious people. And religious people are seeing the Soviets getting rid of them, not as a bunch of misguided ideologues, but as evil and satanic. So that causes a friction that you could never overcome. Am I making sense there?
It's still a friction going. Because you'll have, I mean, and there's some shit about Karl Marx's like family being Talmudic rabbis. And you could go into that, which is true, but it's like, that doesn't mean it's a formal conspiracy and shit. And there is kind of like, but yeah, it's just a whole, it's present now because a lot of left-wing ideologies still kind of.
Okay, so anyway, so socialist ideology is about, coercion. You have to get rid of the church, kill all these people and so on. But it made sense to a lot of people. Now, Zionism, right? Zionism also must be seen as an ideology that made sense, to a lot of Jews. I mean, the main factor why modern Zionism arose is to escape anti-Semitism in Europe. And so, for example, I'll give you let me give you the 3-minute history of Zionism, right? So you have of political Zionism. So you have Theodor Herzl, who is the founder of political Zionism. He wrote a very famous book called, The Jewish State, right? So Theodor Herzl is seeing, and he's saying, wait a minute, how can we make things better for the Jews? There's anti-Semitism. There was the famous Dreyfus affair. A French Jew in France was erroneously accused of being a spy for the Germans. This happened in 1890 or something like that, I think. He's wrongly accused. And then the newspapers are saying, oh, look, the Jews are bad. They never have, they're not good French soldiers or whatever. So the bottom line is that Theodor Herzl and a lot of concerned Jews are like, wait a minute, maybe we can overcome anti-Semitism by having our own country. If we have our own country where we could just be there, then that's how we can solve the problem of anti-Semitism, right? It kind of made sense to the guy. Now, very briefly, let's look at some of the reasons why we have anti-Semitism, right? For example, the Catholic Church and the Islamic world, they have strong bans on charging interest on loans. Okay, they made it very hard for you to be a moneylender or a banker. So if the Christian world outlaws banking for Christians and the Islamic world outlaws banking for Muslims, then the only people who can be financiers and bankers are the Jews, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So
yeah, I've heard this. It's called usury or something.
Exactly. So by the Christian and Islamic world outlawing banking for Muslims and Christians, they have essentially created a monopoly for the Jews in finance and banking. Right?
Oh, I wonder how the state creates monopolies. How could you? Well, now we get back to that.
Exactly.
Through, different historical lens, but continue.
Right. So now, if you are economically ignorant, or you hate the fact that you got to pay back the loans, you're going to hate the Jews, right? Because if the Jews are the bankers and you do not understand the benefits of banking, how it allows people to pool their money together, without banking, you could never build a skyscraper. Who the hell has enough savings or friends that have enough money to build a skyscraper or a massive auto manufacturing plant? You need finance and banking to pool the savings together to do all these complicated things. But if you're economically ignorant, like the socialists, like Hitler, and the clueless masses, you're going to hate the Jews for being the bankers, and the money changers. So that's one reason why the Jews were additionally disliked. Another very important reason why the Jews were disliked, this is very important, and I'm sure you're aware that there was a massive overrepresentation of Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution and in atheistic communist movements, right? Mm-hmm. For example, at the end of the First World War, when Germany lost the First World War, there were 3 minor communist governments in German cities, in Bavaria, in Munich, in some of these places during the chaos. And the 3 of them were led by Jews. Rosa Luxemburg, some other guy, right? So Jews inadvertently were very attracted to communism because, first of all, if you're going to get rid of religion and now everybody's going to be equal because we're all going to be atheists, it gets rid of one of the major sources of oppression. Does that make sense?
For Jewish people, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Another thing that made Jews overly represented in communism is that Jews were slightly better educated than non-Jews in Russia, right? Because you might have heard, Jews put a strong emphasis on being able to read and write so they can read the Torah, so they can read the Bible and so on. So on average, Jews were better educated in Russia. And if you're better educated, you're naturally going to rise higher in a bureaucracy where the better educated are supposed to coerce and tell everybody else what to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there were many environmental factors that had nothing to do with some grand conspiracy that inadvertently made it so that the Jews would be overly represented in communism, right? And of course they were. There's Karl Marx, the leading ideologue who wrote the book, Trotsky. Okay, a lot of people don't know this, but Trotsky, who was like best friends with Lenin, Lenin offered Trotsky to be the first leader of the Soviet Union. When the Bolshevik Revolution was going on, Lenin told Trotsky, look, you get to be the first leader of the Soviet Union because I think you're a better orator. You're smarter than me. You can be the guy. And Trotsky told Lenin, no, thanks, but I don't want to be the first leader of the Soviet Union because there's no way we're going to have a Jew, be the leader of Russia. So I mean, Trotsky was the head of the Red Army, right? The Red Army was out there killing everyone, So you had a lot of top leaders. Yeah. So I think half of the leaders in the Bolshevik party that voted to have an armed insurrection during the Bolshevik Revolution, half of them were Jews. So, but then what happens? A lot of people see the inadvertent Jewish overrepresentation in communism, and they'll say, oh, this was a plot by the Jews, or the Jews did it on purpose. And that's
go back to the George Carlin quote.
Exactly. And that is a massive error, right? And we see these anti-Jewish fallacies everywhere. People love to say that the Jews do this, that they run the banks. Of course they run the banks. If the Christian world and the Islamic world says a Christian and a Muslim can't be a banker, then the Jews are going to run the banks, right? So you can't blame the Jews for being overrepresented in things that they find themselves there, not because of some sinister conspiracy, but because complex history. So I just gave you a couple of examples of why, the Jews are being extra vilified. But then here's an important reason why we can very easily see that Zionism was a mistake. What is anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is a set of fallacies that lead to Jews having their private property and their personal individual rights be overrun. That's what it is. Anti-Semitism is just a set of fallacies. Now, how do we overcome fallacies? We overcome fallacies through reason, through logic, by trying to understand them, by having sympathy for the people who are making mistakes. That's how we overcome fallacies. But Zionism didn't do that. Zionism said, oh, wait a minute. Through some irrational mythical force, we don't know why, sometimes people mistreat Jews, and the best thing we can do, never mind trying to understand it, we just have to abandon the thousands of synagogues and cities where we have lived for hundreds of years with everyone else. We have to abandon that, and we have to create our own country in a faraway land, that is mentioned in our Bible, okay? And we have to coerce everyone in there to live under our Jewish state with a Jewish flag and a Jewish national anthem. Oh, don't worry, we'll give you equal rights, but it's going to be our Jewish state. And this is the only way we can overcome anti-Semitism because you guys are bad.
There's a quote. They're like that the only way the Jewish state could survive is with anti-Semitism.
No. Yeah, and that quote comes from not survive, but Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism. He even said it himself. He said, quote, the anti-Semites will be our best friends. They will drive, if where there was no anti-Semitism in the past, there will be now. And they will, so again, if you're a Zionist, anti-Semitism is what justifies your ideology, right? And Theodor Herzl, hardly anyone knows, but Theodor Herzl was a total secular atheist. So a lot of people who look at Israel as God commands us to support Israel and all this, it's all nonsense because Theodor Herzl was a hardcore atheist. He one time thought, and he really wrote about this, he wanted to get the Pope to convert all the Jews to Christianity as a way to overcome anti-Semitism. I mean, that's how.
There's also a thing where Ben Gurion, first president, was, or prime minister, whatever, was a socialist. Like he was very left leaning and very into central planning, and especially with like he wanted to turn some desert into a forest, which I think happened. But there's some like forest fire that happened. So there's a whole thing there. Yeah. So a lot of early players in Zionism were socialists. So talk about the kind of overlap.
And Ben Gurion. Like Ben Gurion himself, he was such a socialist that he went to Moscow. He went to the Soviet Union, I think in 1923, to celebrate the 7th anniversary of the October Revolution. That's how much of a communist he was. And he writes about being so happy to see Trotsky, who was a fellow Jew, because Trotsky was a hero to Ben Gurion. So yeah, a lot of people don't know that the country of Israel was just founded by a bunch of totally clueless people, totally clueless. A bunch of atheist people who knew nothing about economics. Israel at the beginning.
They were good salesmen. They got the best billionaires to back them. And they knew how to appeal to them.
They fooled themselves, into their ideology. And also, so again, but the key thing is that to realize that Zionism, since it never overcame the intellectual fallacies, it only made them worse. Because again, the minute you realize that anti-Semitism is a set of intellectual errors that must be overcome through freedom and understanding, competition of ideas, logic, reason, sympathy, that's how we overcome anti-Semitism, by understanding the fallacies. And I just told you a few of them, right? The Jews were hated because they were overrepresented in banking. The Jews were hated by the Nazis because they were overrepresented in the Bolshevik Revolution. But once you understand and you make sense out of these errors, then the errors go away and we can treat everyone as equals. We gave women equal rights. We overcame slavery, right? So that's the thing. Once you realize that this idea that in order to overcome anti-Semitism, the Jews had to live around in their own separate country, and coerce everyone to live under their kumbaya design, it becomes obvious that it could only spark what we have now, which has just been 100 years of conflict, and calamity. And I do want to read one quote. So to me, this is like, whenever I tell someone to really understand the history of Zionism, I tell everyone to read the essay by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Vladimir Jabotinsky is the father of the Likud party. Netanyahu's party?
Yeah. I know that dude. Yeah.
Right. I'm sure you've heard about him. So Vladimir Jabotinsky in 1923, long before Hitler, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, we need Israel because the Nazis, because of anti-Semitism, because of the Second World War. No. The fallacy of Zionism existed long before the Nazis came to power. So Vladimir Jabotinsky, he wrote a classic essay called The Iron Wall, written in 1923. And this is what he says, okay? He says, quote, "There can be no voluntary agreement between ourselves and the Palestine Arabs, not now, nor in the prospective future. It is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a Jewish majority. Culturally, they, the Arabs, are 500 years behind us." Such arrogance. "They have neither our endurance nor our determination. We hold that Zionism is moral and just. And since it is moral and just, justice must be done, no matter whether Joseph or Simon or Ivan or Ahmed agree with it or not. There is no other morality." End quote.
That's crazy. There is no other morality. And wasn't he instrumental in bombing of the King David Hotel?
No. That is Menachem Begin.
That's Begin, yeah. He suffered a lot. I mean, he was a prisoner for a very long time.
Oh,
his story's compelling. I mean, he's a terrible human being, but there's no doubt that he had some suffering in his life that led to where he went.
Yeah. I mean, terrible human being. Everybody
misguided. Let's use that word.
Yeah, I mean, remember, we're all a product of how we grow up and how we see things. Again, remember, I grew up in a communist family. I can't say my family members were like evildoers. Right?
Yeah.
Right. And
Captain something. Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
Right. And Mises, I got to throw it in there. There's a couple of quotes from Mises that do a wonderful job of showing how we need sympathy for understanding like the world. Look, Mises said the following. He said, neither as judges allotting praise and blame, nor as avengers seeking out the guilty should we face the past. We seek truth, not guilt. We want to know how things came about to understand them, not to issue condemnations. That's very nice, right? Like, again, the communists, they fool themselves into tyranny. We can't just say, oh, these were the bad guys. You know what I mean? We need sympathy to understand how people fool themselves into then creating chaos. And one more Mises quote. Mises says, history should teach us to recognize causes and to understand driving forces. And when we understand everything, we will forgive everything.
That's crazy. When we understand everything, we'll forgive everything. That's good.
That's a good one. Yeah, because once we understand how the Zionists fooled themselves into creating so much harm, that, we can have some forgiveness, So anyway, so that quote by Jabotinsky. So here is where we can see the similarity again with Zionism and communism, because Jabotinsky is saying that Zionism is the moral thing to do. You either back Zionism or now you are immoral and to suffer the consequences. And this is exactly what happened with the communists, right? To the communists, you either had to back their morality, we're all going to share, we're all going to do whatever the experts say, we're going to share the wealth, we're going to do whatever the planners say, I'm going to go along with the bureaucracy, and if you don't go along with it, you're a capitalist saboteur, you're not playing nice, you're a criminal. So we can see, again, how both groups of people fool themselves into making to coerce the rest of the world into a disastrous morality. And that is what we're seeing now. The Zionists fool themselves into, we have a right to our state, and we have a right, and the Palestinians don't want to go along, and they're doing bad things, and we have a right to expel them, to treat them, and this. So just like the Soviets, just like Lenin felt justified in getting rid of the religious people, in killing the kulaks. The kulaks were the farmers in the Soviet Union who hired laborers. Any small businessman in the Soviet Union during Lenin's days, small farmers, because everybody was still a farmer in Russia at the time, they were called the kulaks. Because if you're a farmer and you hire laborers, you're profiting off their labor. You're a profiting capitalist exploiter to be killed in socialist morality. So they kill the kulaks, they kill the religious people, the same way the Zionists feel justified in expelling the Palestinians and in ultimately making criminals out of everyone who is critical of their ideology. They have no choice but to eventually kill us. They'll have to kill me too, because I think Zionism was a mistake. So that was a great
killing me too. So it's kind of like, where is it headed? Where is it headed there? Because let's get modern real quick. Because where do you personally think this is headed?
I think it's, I think it's headed to either a solution where we can learn from the Soviet Union, right? And I'm not going to get too deep into it, but how did the Soviet Union ultimately collapse? When you really understand the history of how the Soviet Union collapsed, it collapsed because they got their Gorbachevs, the reformers, right? Mikhail Gorbachev was a part of the system. He was a Soviet who grew up believing all the bullshit, right? But then because of the chaos, because of the failure, and thanks to the Austrians, thanks to Mises and Hayek writing books and people learning, like Milton Friedman, right? Famous free marketeer, he won the Nobel Prize in 1976. Milton Friedman said that it was Hayek's writings that did the most to ultimately help bring about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm totally butchering the quote. But yeah, it was through persuasion that eventually some people high up in the Soviet bureaucracy, they said, okay, yeah, too much chaos. Our system is not working. And there's actually a wonderful video clip of Mikhail Gorbachev being interviewed by Larry King, the famous interviewer who already retired a few years ago, where they ask him, how do you see communism? And Gorbachev admitted, look, it was a failed system. And we learn, and that's it. So the way I see Zionism ending, it's hopefully the exact same way. Remember, communism didn't end in a massive final world war between the communists and the capitalists. It broke apart once enough people decided to let it. Yeah. Exactly. So I can only hope that with the current chaos that we're seeing. There's a lot more people that are critical of Zionism, what they're doing, and the arguments are getting better and better and better. And I really do have faith that someday we will find some Zionist Gorbachevs. We'll find enough people inside Israel that get popular enough and say, wait a minute, we need to change this big time. We need to have maybe like a big single state where everybody gets equal rights, and it'll be a state that does away with Zionism, coercing everyone into a Jewish flag or a Jewish national anthem. In order to get rid of Zionism, you don't have to kick out all the Jews and send them back to Europe or send them back to, all you have to do is just change the character of the state. A state that treats everyone equally.
Well, I mean, and I could see a reformist type of person coming in, because right now you have a divide in Israel's government. You have the kind of far right Likud party who just wants to annihilate anything in their path, create greater Israel, bring about the next Messiah. And then you have the sort of reformists that are like there's one argument right now going on with protests that are saying, why are you so focused on destroying Hamas and destroying the civilians? Why don't you just do a small negotiation or operation and we'll leave it be? That's one side of the government there. And even though there's still some flaws within that side of the government, that's preferred, that's reformist, that's fine, And then, but obviously the more appealing thing to people there is the Likud party's thing, and it's been more effective there historically. So there's that. Or you could have if there's no reformist thing that leads to a small dissolution or peaceful government there, or you have them destroying where they want to build the third temple, destroying the mosque that sits on top of that, thus causing more war, which would lead to a world war potentially, or in a Samson option going into there. So that's one thing I was kind of talking about.
So what is the Samson option? What is the Samson option to educate your readers? What is the Samson option?
Real quick, Samson option relates to a story in the Bible where a character brings down a crumbling temple upon himself and his enemies. Their nuclear policy, which is a policy based in deception and lying. They stole their nuclear secrets from the United States. They don't tell anybody how much nuclear weapons they have. They have never signed the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and they view any country in the regions that is against them, such as Iran, not viable, not reasonable enough to have nuclear weapons. And if the existence of their state is threatened, they will unleash a storm of nuclear missiles on the region around them in order to prevent or take down other countries with their state if that existence is threatened, or prevent their state from crumbling. And that could happen. I mean, you can, there's a video I saw, I'll have to put this in and edit this in, of flags going around of the third temple. There's multiple flags in Israel on street poles flying around that are, drawings of a third temple being built. And they did sacrifice the red heifer, which is a cow that is like what they say. So they're trying to do that. They're trying to usher in a new Messiah, and they're trying to usher in this sort of like new age for them. And it's a whole fucking thing that would lead to more destruction.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's just so complex the way things inadvertently evolve, because when Theodor Herzl, a secular Jew, when he was envisioning his Israel, he would have never imagined that Israel would eventually be run by a bunch of hyper-religious fanatics. He never would have envisioned what is happening right now in Israel, where the religious parties have just like taken over, and it's a battle of good versus evil, and we got to kill everyone. Amalek, and all of this nonsense. And in many ways, like, to me, like, Zionism is going to end, It will end eventually, because we're also in a race against time and technology. Sooner or later, some distraught person is going to be able to FedEx a nuclear bomb, because we're in a race against technology. You know that the Houthis, right? The Houthis already have ballistic missiles that can reach Israel. And the Houthis are super poor. So sooner or later, as technology improves, it gets easier and easier and easier for any small disgruntled group of people to be able to come up with more powerful bombs, with more powerful drones, right? And I really do believe that Israel, will eventually get overpowered by a lot of these disgruntled terrorists, you could call it terrorist attacks or whatever it is. So to me, I mean, the Israelis they fool themselves because they do have the backing of the Western world, you know, and they think that because they have the Palantir and they have all this technology and they are, you know, with the West, that they can silence everyone. But we can't have a worldwide police state, you know. It's still going to happen. So I think that Zionism eventually, since it was an intellectual error, I do believe it'll be overcome through reason and logic. You know, hopefully it does not spark the final world war. And I also do not want, you know, a nuke going off in Tel Aviv, you know, killing, you know, 3 million people. That too would also be horrible. What we want is sympathy, understanding, and something that solves that mess. But again, to me, Zionism will end like eventually. You know, it could also end once we get killed, you know. That's another way of ending it. You know, once I get killed, you know, it's over for me.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. I mean, if some rapper in Chicago can get RPG, why can't somebody in the Middle East get an RPG? Everybody can get an RPG, you know? So there's that whole thing with the terrorism there. And I mean, I had somebody on a good clip where we talk about, you know, why Hamas is the only option to them, really, the Palestinians. But that's a whole thing. Definitely would recommend listening. Anybody in the audience listen to my episode with Jason Willits, former our soldier in Afghanistan and Iraq, has a lot of insight into that. But yeah, I mean, even with the just the support, right? They don't have the support of the West. Technically, they do on a technical level of who runs the government and who runs certain companies. But I would say, if anybody scrolled through TikTok the past couple of fucking months, everybody's now anti-Zionist. I mean, you know, but, more than half the population.
But it's very bad too. Like, there again, like I do not want. I am against. Like, for example, if I could be over there, if I were Mashal Khalid, he was one of the founders of Hamas. You know, if I were over there and I were a Palestinian, again, I see Zionism as an intellectual error. I am against like armed resistance. You know, I think that the Palestinians, you know, and the Iranians, you know, if they have obviously a lot of grievances, you know, with the Zionist state, we should just try to explain, make more progress in the intellectual sphere. You know, if so right now some wealthy Palestinian or some wealthy Arab buys copies of some great books, you know, like Ilan Pape is a famous, you know, he's a Jewish critic of Zionism. If we take $10 million and suddenly we give out free copies of a book that does a good job of showing why Zionism was a mistake at the middle of Wall Street in New York City, you know, again, my point is that I see Zionism as an intellectual error, and armed resistance, calling the Zionist evil or the synagogue of Satan. For example, I'm a huge fan. I love Candace Owens, right? You know her.
Yeah,
I love her. Are you a fan of her?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love how she has the courage to talk about the Zionification of the American government. Zionism is our religion. I mean, sadly, it's a sad thing to admit, but Bibi comes, he gives a speech in Congress, he gets more than one standing ovation per minute. Not even the Pope could get that much approval over here, right? You know, so I love how she says the truth. You know, all of our politicians just do whatever Netanyahu wants. You know, she knows, but she has said that Netanyahu is being controlled by satanic forces. She has referred to a lot of Zionists as being run by the synagogue of Satan. When you make this like religious-based attacks on the Zionists, which are just people who have fooled themselves into an error, again, you're not overcoming the fallacies. You know, we're not going to get out of this mess by saying that these people are evil and we are the good guys.
Yeah.
You see my point?
I know what you mean. I mean, a lot of people can make that error because, I mean, if fucking like majority of America is Christian, I mean, that's fine. I'm Christian, you know,
right.
But yeah, it's not a reasonable approach to it. You know? But
yeah, so I do not like the hard left, you know, the political hard left. They love to call the Zionists a bunch of capitalist, racist, white conquerors who came over here with their capitalism to exploit.
And that shit's wrong too.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's wrong. That's wrong. If you're going to make a mistake, as a matter of fact, Zionist power grows from anti-Jewish fallacies. Whenever the hard left goes to a university and they say that the Zionists are just a bunch of white capitalist exploiters, that brings the clamp, that gives more power to the Zionists. Whenever on the religious right, whenever some people say, oh, that the Jews are the synagogue of Satan, you know, that the Jews killed Jesus and they're evil and they do usury, and just because there's Jews overrepresented in pornography, the Jews are responsible for all the problems in culture. Whenever they make those errors, more power goes to the Zionists.
I mean, it goes back to the quote of Herzl. I mean, he says that like their state, I'm paraphrasing, couldn't exist without anti-Semitism, and that will, you know, just continue to happen if people start to make those fallacies, as you say, because it's just easy. I mean, it's just easy to make those fallacies. It's like, because you don't really have to look, you know, fucking past or certain
exactly
shit, you know?
And it is the role of those of us who are trying to make sense of things to understand the fallacies and communicate with people and see how we can we need to overcome the anti-Semitic fallacies as well as the Zionist ones. If you're only focused on bitching about the Zionists and how they feel like they have no other choice but to corral all the Palestinians and destroy Gaza and kick them out, and you're not also criticizing the people who make anti-Semitic fallacies and who do bad things to the Jews, then you're making a mistake. We need to have sympathy and understanding of all the fallacies. And regarding the Herzl one, I just remember the quote. So this is what Herzl said. Herzl said, the anti-Semites will be our most steadfast friends. The anti-Semitic countries will be our allies. Great exertions will hardly be necessary to spur on the movement. Anti-Semites provide the requisite impetus. They need only to do what they did before, and they will create a desire to emigrate where it did not previously exist and strengthen it where it didn't exist before. So,
yeah. I mean, yeah. No, all right. So, but thank you for coming on. This was a great episode. I really appreciate you coming here. We covered a lot of topics. And let's do another one another time. We definitely got to talk about hip hop, not right now, but you know, where can people find you though that want to read a lot of your work? You also have some audiobooks you put on YouTube and interviews on your Rumble, of course. But where can people find you?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for taking an interest in, you know, all the stuff that we're talking about here. And so I'd love to get more followers on my Twitter account, so they can follow me at Hayekian, like Friedrich Hayek, Hayekian, or Selma Hayek. Hayekian, so please follow me on Twitter.
Selma Hayek.
Yeah. And also, I do have a personal website where now I'm just putting some of these interviews. I'll be putting them in there. So just my last name, Besada.com. And that is the best way to find me.
Yeah. And again, thank you for coming on the show. Everybody go check them out if you want to kind of understand a different kind of understanding of certain events or historical events and obviously economics and stuff. And but no, thanks for coming on the show. Everybody be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and definitely, you know, if you're listening on Spotify, follow it. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, follow it. And obviously YouTube, we're on Rumble, Odyssey, and BitChute as well. We definitely try to support our free speech platforms. And again, thank you for coming on the show.
All right, thank you.